Bienvenidos, bienvenidas a esta sesión inaugural del curso 2020-2021 de Aula Árabe Universitaria. Los saludo desde Madrid, desde nuestra sede aquí en Casa Árabe. Para quien no lo sepa aún, Aula Árabe Universitaria es un programa interuniversitario anual organizado por Casa Árabe en colaboración con las universidades de Madrid. Su objetivo es impulsar el conocimiento sobre el mundo árabe y complementar la formación impartida en los programas universitarios asociados. Eso sí, desde una perspectiva multidisciplinar, es decir, no solamente enfocada en temas de geopolítica, sino realmente combinando todos los intereses que estos programas de posgrado tienen, ¿no? Y entonces la idea es ofrecer a los estudiantes el contacto con ponentes y con expertos relevantes a nivel internacional en estas materias y temáticas relacionadas con la región que nos ocupa, el mundo árabe e islámico. Estas conferencias son el resultado de la propuesta de los programas de máster y de grado asociados y cuyo contenido se adapta al currículo y a las necesidades temáticas de los propios estudiantes, ¿no? La del día de hoy se hace concretamente en colaboración con el máster en estudios árabes e islámicos contemporáneos de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, la UAM, representada por el profesor Ignacio Gutiérrez de Terán, que está por unirse a nuestra charla. Tenemos algunos todavía temas técnicos que afinar para poder conectarnos con él. Originalmente, es cierto, habíamos previsto esta actividad como una actividad presencial, como el año pasado, que tuvo mucho éxito, mucha asistencia por parte de los estudiantes, de los alumnos, pero debido al avance de la pandemia, hemos tenido que modificarlo y traerlo al mundo online. Nuestra invitada de hoy iba a venir desde fuera, pero también ha tenido que cancelar su viaje, lamentablemente, por las mismas razones. Esta primera entrega, entonces, va a ser transmitida como una conferencia de Casa Árabe en directo. Las siguientes se harán en sesiones específicas para los estudiantes en la plataforma que ellos acorden con sus programas y se van a grabar y se emitirán posteriormente en nuestro canal YouTube. En el caso de hoy, podéis participar en el chat abierto haciendo preguntas que luego le formularemos a nuestra ponente. También es importante que para quienes quieren tener constancia de asistencia a esta charla, a esta conferencia, como saben, hacemos todo un pasaporte de las distintas conferencias o aulas árabes de este programa 2020-2021. Entonces, os vamos a pedir, como no tenemos forma ahora de pediros asistencia formal, que en el mismo chat en el que podéis hacer las preguntas, escribáis vuestro nombre y el programa al que pertenecéis, el que estáis cursando, y tomaremos nota justamente para registrar vuestra asistencia. ¿Vale? Entonces, el chat esperamos que esté activo, no solo para registrar su asistencia, sino también para que una vez que vayan saliendo preguntas o dudas sobre la conferencia de nuestra ponente, pues las hagáis, por favor. Pues ahora sí, Lina Khatib es nuestra invitada del día de hoy. Ella es directora del Programa de Oriente, Medio y Norte de África en Chatham House. Es un placer tenerla por aquí. Welcome, Lina. It's such a pleasure to have you in our virtual Casa Árabe. We would have loved to have you both in Madrid and Cordoba as it was originally planned. And unfortunately, the circumstances have required us to change this completely. But we trust that the talk will be equally interesting and lively with you connected now from Italy. You were supposed to be flying all the way from Rome, I think, and visit us and join us in this first session of Aula Árabe, or Arab classroom. It's part of our special series of talks in collaboration with the universities of Madrid. I'm certain that the students and our general public audience will enjoy your expertise. I will first, since Ignacio was meant to introduce you, I will very briefly introduce he hasn't been able to connect yet. We're having some technical problems. So I will introduce you to our students. Lina Khatib es directora, como decía, del Programa de Oriente, Medio y Norte de África en Chatham House. Es investigadora asociada en también SOAS, la School of Oriental and African Studies en Londres. Anteriormente fue investigadora asociada senior en la Arab Reform Initiative, directora del Centro de Oriente Medio de la Fundación Carnegie en Beirut, cofundadora del Programa sobre Reforma Árabe y Democracia en el Centro sobre Democracia, Desarrollo y Estado de Derecho de la Universidad de Stanford y profesora en la Royal Holloway de la Universidad de Londres. Es desde 2008 coeditora, fundadora del Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication, y su investigación se centra en las relaciones internacionales de Oriente Medio, en grupos islamistas y seguridad, en transiciones políticas y política exterior, con especial atención al conflicto sirio. Y hoy esta sesión inaugural nos va a llevar por tres países, estos tres países que consideramos de suma importancia por estar en el corazón de la región que nos ocupa, que es el epicentro de Oriente Medio: Irak, Siria y Líbano. Tres países con crisis de larga duración en el mundo árabe que se encuentran fuertemente conectadas a varios niveles. Y Lina, pues, nos va a ofrecer una lectura de este complejo sistema sociopolítico en el que múltiples variables y agendas, tanto domésticas como internacionales, interaccionan y, desde luego, pues, generan estos conflictos a los cuales asistimos perplejos, ¿verdad? Muchas veces por la velocidad y por la violencia con la que estallan. Entonces, yo no voy a dilatar más ya mi intervención. Esperamos poder contar con Ignacio Gutiérrez de Terán a lo largo de la charla con Lina. Y bueno, agradecemos por supuesto a todos los que están conectadas, estudiantes, alumnos de grado y público en general, el unirse a a esta primera sesión. Esperamos que sigan asistiendo al programa de Aula Árabe Universitaria, que viene muy interesante este año. Tenemos la programación en nuestra página web. So, without further delay, Lina, I know you understood perfectly what I've just said. But the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes or so.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be addressing everyone who is joining us this evening. And it's a shame that I can't be with you in person, but we have to do what we can, and here we are. Thank you so much for tuning in. The motivation behind my lecture, the reason why I chose to connect these three conflicts, is because very often people are so focused when they study these different conflicts on what's happening inside each country that they may think it's just something specific to that country that's not connected to the wider regional picture. So I'm trying to say that there is a thread that connects these conflicts in terms of the mechanics of each conflict. But at the same time, there are domestic dynamics that are particular to Lebanon and Syria and Iraq that play out in the different crises in these three countries that sometimes can be a bit similar. So when we say similar, I don't mean they're identical, because each country has its own specific characteristics. But I think it's important to kind of think about them thematically as well, because this will help us understand the crises from a perhaps more nuanced view than if we were just to focus on conflict as violence. Violence, of course, plays part in what I'm going to talk about, but it's not the full picture. It doesn't describe the full picture. So what is the link that I'm talking about between these three conflicts? Obviously, if we start with the Syrian conflict, a key characteristic of why Syria is the way it is, with people having risen up against this regime, is because the regime itself was oppressive. We have, unfortunately, until now in Syria, a political system in which the social contract between the ruler and the citizen is a very flawed one. It's a system that, as we know, is highly autocratic. It's a system based on the regime basically having a network of loyalists that it wants to empower in order to rule the country with relative ease, while also accumulating wealth that is not shared with the rest of the population. So we have a huge gap in Syria between the haves and have-nots that contributed greatly to the rise of the conflict in the first place. And in addition to the economic and social dimension, there's, of course, the political dimension, as Syria was and still is an autocracy with no space for political participation in the full sense of the word. And so a lot of us who look at Syria obviously are familiar with these dynamics. And if we look at now comparatively to Iraq and Lebanon, one might say, well, actually, the situation in Iraq and Lebanon is not as bad. And that is true, because we don't have wars raging in Iraq and Lebanon as we do in Syria today. But when we think about the thematics of the system, how we describe the political system in Iraq and Lebanon, even though the political system in these countries is not the same as Syria, there are some commonalities there in terms of the gap between the haves and have-nots, in terms of people not being able to fully participate politically in their own countries. So if we think about Iraq and Lebanon particularly, in addition to what I've just described, there's also a presence of what we can call an elite pact, which is an agreement between the different politicians who are in charge. And this agreement is done so that they all get a share of the pie, which keeps them basically in power. So in a way, the state building exercise became an exercise in wealth accumulation. People aspire to power in these countries because getting to power means they get access to wealth. And this is mainly through siphoning off state resources, unfortunately. And very often in both countries, we see identity politics being used as a way for these politicians to kind of acquire what they see as legitimacy for themselves. So we have a very sectarian-based system in place in Iraq and Lebanon, whereby politicians try to use sect-based identity to rally support for themselves amongst their constituents. Now, with time, interestingly, in Iraq, the identity-based political system shifted gradually from being very much about sectarian quotas to being about political quotas, because you had different political parties representing the same sects competing with one another. So it's not just about sectarian identity, it's also about political coalitions. And I will say the same about Lebanon. Although sectarian-based politics is very much alive and well, what we have to remember in the political system in Lebanon is that ultimately it's a system in which political parties compete over power while using sometimes sectarianism as a rallying tool. But ultimately, it's all about the pursuit of power, wealth, and legitimacy. So here, what I'm saying is don't do away with sectarianism as an issue, but don't look at it as the main feature of the political systems. Now, you might say, how is this related to Syria, then, the issue of sectarianism? Interestingly enough, before 2011, sectarianism did not really play out as an issue in Syria. However, the regime of Bashar al-Assad stoked sectarian tensions in Syria as a way to instill fear amongst the population, especially the country's minorities, the Christians mainly, but also the Alawi community that the president of Syria comes from, and stoking also sectarian tension vis-a-vis rising Islamist jihadists who happen to be Sunni. And therefore, sectarianism was used as a tool to rally the masses against what was then an uprising in 2011. So here what I'm saying is we have political systems dominated by elites that use ideology as a way to give legitimacy for themselves, also kind of keep their populations in check. Now, of course, when we talk about here elites having pacts, accumulating wealth, we're also, of course, talking about rampant corruption in these countries. And so if you look at Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, you will see that in all of them, there is a lot of corruption. So for example, if you look at the civil service is used in Lebanon and Iraq by the political elites as a way to reward their constituents. So in a way, people become civil servants, not necessarily because they're qualified, but because the political leaders use these jobs in the state as rents. So it's a kind of rentierism. It's a way for these politicians to keep their loyalists loyal, basically. But in addition, what we have with the corruption in the system is that it makes the state quite weak, because when you have politicians who are using state resources in this way, in addition to also stealing money for themselves, and this happens in Lebanon and it happens in Iraq, then state institutions become very weak. And when they are weak, they are not able to deliver even basics to their citizens. So you see in Iraq, even though the country is rich in oil, there are electricity shortages. You see Lebanon, which is rich in water, suffering from water shortages. It's not because the country doesn't have the natural resources, but because the natural resources are not reaching the citizens because of corruption that dominates the political system. Now, in Syria, of course, there's also a lot of corruption in the sense that the president's inner circle, which tends to be his family, have acquired control over key functions of the state. For example, the telecommunications sector was until very recently under the control of the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, Rami Makhlouf. Very recently, Rami Makhlouf and Bashar al-Assad fell out, and Rami Makhlouf is now kind of out of favor, but the telecom sector is still in the hands of the regime, basically. So Rami Makhlouf was just the figurehead leading that particular service, but ultimately we're talking here, it's the inner circle of the regime that's controlling resources. And when you have this kind of control, of course, you're not going to basically plant the seeds of stability later on. The third thing that we have seen in these three countries is the proliferation of militias. Now, in Lebanon, as you know, there has been a militia called Hezbollah that has become the most dominant political entity in Lebanon. And I think Hezbollah is worth looking at because it's a very interesting example of a militia that began life in the 80s as a resistance movement against Israeli occupation in Lebanon, but that with time grew to become a very powerful political party and also part of the economic elite in the country. So Hezbollah started out as being outside the political system that I just described in Lebanon, but today it is very much part of the same political system. Hezbollah managed to use its acts of liberation of Lebanon from Israel, because it managed to kick Israel out in 2000 and liberate southern Lebanon from the occupation. So it used that for legitimacy, and people accepted that. However, over the years, Hezbollah managed to keep its weapons on the basis that this is needed to defend Lebanon, but use these weapons to intimidate its opponents politically and therefore rise as the country's most powerful political actor today. And Hezbollah has been in place since the 80s. So we're talking basically a generation in which this militia has evolved. And now it has full say, I will say, over the Lebanese cabinet. Before that, in the previous Lebanese cabinet, it had veto power in the cabinet. No other political entity in Lebanon has this extent of power. And so it's very important when we look at the phenomenon of militias, not just to look at them as a security issue or a military issue or just participants in fighting, because Hezbollah is an example of how these militias over the years can grow to play a political role, but also, as I said, an economic role. So when we look at Hezbollah today, because it's a Shia group, it was primarily concerned with providing for the Shia community in Lebanon. So it, in a way, used a similar model of rallying support to what I just described earlier about the political system as a whole, which is using sectarianism to rally support. And in order to do that, it had to provide for its community, which means providing for them financially, providing for them in terms of basic services. And here we see that with weak state institutions that I spoke about having risen as a result of the political system, Hezbollah came to present itself as an alternative. It said the state cannot deliver basic services, but Hezbollah can. The state cannot defend Lebanon from external aggression, so Hezbollah's weapons are needed for defense. Hezbollah therefore became also economically very powerful. It was a way for its community to kind of climb the social ladder because Hezbollah granted them economic privileges. Now, if we look at the situation of Iraq today to compare, Iraq is more complicated than Lebanon in that regard because there's no one group that has risen to kind of play a similar role to Hezbollah. But Iraq is witnessing a proliferation of militias called the Popular Mobilization Units, who, like Hezbollah, are also supported by Iran. And these militias came about in the aftermath of the rise of the Islamic State terrorist group, ISIS or Daesh. These groups rose, and again, if you think about the case of Hezbollah using Israel as a legitimacy kind of reason, these groups did the same thing. They said, we are needed because we want to liberate Iraq from ISIS. And again, they had a military victory against ISIS, again, compare with Hezbollah winning against Israel, and used that to get legitimacy for themselves in the country. But at the same time, they used this military victory as a way to access political power. So when Iraq had elections in 2018, some of these groups formed political parties that contested the parliamentary election and won lots of seats. And today, I will say that the political system in Iraq is also dominated by these militias who have huge influence over where the country is going. You may have heard recently there's been tension between the United States and these groups because some of them keep attacking the US embassy in Baghdad. And the United States is considering removing its embassy from Baghdad and moving it to Kurdistan, to Erbil. So this just gives you an example of how influential and powerful these militias have become in Iraq politically, but also economically. So again, being part of these militias has become a way for people to climb the social ladder, because if you become part of these militias, you get privileges. You get money, for example, for your family if there's a martyr, for instance, in the family. But also, these militias have very often taken over some of the, for example, smuggling activities that used to be run by ISIS. So they now control the same smuggling networks. Interestingly enough, these militias also cooperate with Hezbollah. So here is where the mechanics of the conflicts get kind of linked. Some of the economic transactions that are happening when it comes to smuggling, smuggling of fuel, smuggling of weapons, smuggling of drugs, these kinds of activities are witnessing heavy involvement by these militias and go all the way from Iraq through Syria and to Lebanon. And of course, when it comes to Syria, both Hezbollah and the Popular Mobilization Units in Iraq sent forces to fight in Syria as well. So here we have a presence for the Iraqi and Lebanese militias inside Syria, as well as militias that, of course, were supported by Iran inside Syria, amongst other militias. But what we're saying here is, if you look at Syria in isolation from what's happening in Iraq and Lebanon, you would be missing the picture. Just like if you only look at these militias in Iraq as just about Iraq, you're also missing the picture. Because it is this connectivity that is also allowing them to get resources, and these resources are used to bolster their military activity and then political activity. So the smuggling, for example, that Hezbollah engages in helps its political project in Lebanon. So we need to think of all these militias kind of together. But that's not just the only outcome of the political systems, because the political systems, as I said, played a role in empowering these militias. The other outcome, of course, is what did this do to the people? In all these countries, we have people who are living under the oppression of the state on the one hand, and these groups on the other hand. However, as I said, these groups are also part of the state. So we shouldn't really see them as non-state actors, because they are very much part of the state. And what we have here is groups that have become very dominant, that do not tolerate any dissent, that rule with coercion. And this is something that is very much vivid in Iraq, as well as Lebanon, as well as Syria. And it's not just, as I said, the militias that are applying coercion, it's state actors as well. And oppression is basically because the leaders in those countries, whether we're talking a dictator like Bashar al-Assad, or we're talking several autocrats in power in Lebanon, or people who got to power democratically, perhaps through elections, for example, in Iraq, let's say members of parliament, but they actually represent not the national interest, but they represent sometimes foreign interests like Iran. Sometimes they just simply represent militia interests, generally speaking. So here we have, even in a kind of, let's say, democratic setting like Iraq, still a problem with state oppression directed at the citizens. So if you imagine yourself being just an ordinary citizen in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, you basically have very few choices, because you're expected to engage in a kind of patron-client social contract with the leader, either getting a job in the civil service, or becoming one of the regime cronies, or perhaps joining one of the militias run by the regime in Syria in return for just staying alive. Or the alternative is basically to be oppressed. And a key thing is, for all of these rulers, the status quo is something that they want to preserve, because it gives them power, and as well, it gives them resources, it gives them wealth. So it's not surprising then that we've seen protests in all those places. Of course, in Syria, the protests mainly happened in 2011, and as we know, the situation evolved into conflict today. But when it comes to Iraq and Lebanon, watchers of the region will know that October 2019 was a very important month because it saw large-scale protests in both places. Now, these were not the first protests that had happened in the country. If anything, Iraq has been witnessing protests for years now, since 2003, and Lebanon also on a much smaller scale, but it witnessed several waves of protests, mainly 2015 and then 2019. But 2019 is very important because in both places, citizens said they want to change the political system. The protests being about the economy and about corruption, but quickly evolved to saying we reject the system. And this is why I started with the system, because the people on the street recognized that the economic hardship that they're facing and all the problems that they are facing are ultimately the result of the system being in place. So they're going back to the source. But of course, in both places, just like Syria, the leaders want to keep the status quo in place. And that's why we have seen heavy crackdowns on protests in Iraq as well as Lebanon. Although when it comes to violence, the level of violence seen in Lebanon is a tiny fraction of the level of violence seen in Iraq. In Iraq, violence is just highly prevalent, unfortunately, in the protests. And a key thing in Iraq is that it is both state institutions like the security forces, as well as militias who are cracking down on the protesters. In Lebanon as well, on a much, much smaller scale, we have also seen thugs belonging to basically militias cracking down on protesters and intimidating them, as well as state forces like the security forces. So this is why my argument is that when we look at these conflicts, it's not just about violence, it's about the economy, it's about politics, it's about the interests of the elites, and also how the militias that feature in the three countries are actually quite connected in terms of military engagement and economic engagement. And that's why it's in the interest of these rulers for the status quo to remain the same. So unfortunately, right now, I don't see very good news for Lebanon or Iraq or Syria. But it's a sobering moment and an important one. And I will end on this note, and I look forward to any questions or comments from anyone joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, Lina Khatib, por esta conferencia que realmente enmarca tanto a Irak y Siria y Líbano en una serie de digamos, patrones de poder que nos permiten entender y leer mejor estos países. Como dijo al final, no son muy buenas noticias. I was just saying that, unfortunately, these are not very good news. Towards the end, it doesn't allow for much optimism. The fact that there is a very there is a corrupt system that aims or wants to preserve the status quo because it is obviously of benefit in terms of, as you mentioned, wealth and power, leaves very little hope for those especially in civil society who want to change. I mean, I'm not sure if people are following the aftermath of the Lebanese explosion, which is extremely damaging for the population, for the economy of a country that was already suffering so much for the past year. But yesterday we got news of the fact that the recently appointed prime minister has stepped down because there is no way he can see any progress. And I think what you have just described helps us understand what is why this prime minister has actually resigned so quickly. Am I right in thinking that precisely because the state is weak and there is so much at stake for the political and sectarian coalitions that exist, there is too much at stake for someone to come and make any change?
Yeah,
How do you explain the current moment?
The status quo is such that you have an elite pact between different politicians who may actually be political competitors, but it is in their interest for the political system to stay in place because that's how they acquire money and power. And so civil society in Lebanon, as well as the people protesting on the streets, are saying we want to change this political system. And one of their key demands is that a cabinet should be formed with technocrats who do not represent any of the ruling political parties. They're saying the country cannot continue like this because it's failing and the state is almost bankrupt, and therefore we need technocrats in place. The prime minister designate, who just stepped down, tried to form a technocratic cabinet, but he was hit with the brick wall of the mainly Hezbollah and its allies refusing and insisting on naming particular ministers in the next cabinet. So here you see how there is a huge disconnect between the street and its demands and also what the country actually needs and what these political elites are willing to do. And it seems to me that they are happy to sacrifice the national interest for the sake of their own personal interests. They do not want to compromise because they fear this would make them lose power. But at the same time, you mentioned, and maybe this is a bit of an, on a slightly happy note, you mentioned the aftermath of the explosion. Now, unfortunately for Lebanon, the state has not really delivered anything to people in the aftermath of the port explosion of August 4. People's houses were damaged, people's livelihoods have been destroyed, and the state has offered people nothing because the state was already weak, plus ruled by these corrupt elites. But civil society has tried its best and is still trying to fill this gap. So we've seen huge citizen mobilization of people just getting down to the streets to sweep the rubble, people trying to help each other rebuild. So in a way, civil society is trying to perform some of the functions that actually the state and its institutions should be performing. This is good news for Lebanon because people are getting together regardless of sectarian background. They're helping one another as citizens, not as members of this sect or that or whatever. So I still have hope for Lebanon in the long run, because this is a sign that there is new awareness among especially the younger generation. And I will say the same thing about the youth in Iraq. The youth are the ones who are protesting, saying we want to change the regime. But for the foreseeable future, it's going to be very tough.
Oh, you're breaking off slightly. ¿Se escucha? Ok. Mira, creo que tenemos a Iñaki, pero no se escucha o se escucha. Por ahora no se escucha. Voy a hacer una pregunta de las que están llegando. Iñaki, si me escuchas, estoy viendo que ya nos están llegando algunas preguntas en el chat en YouTube. Tenemos una pregunta de Daniel López Roche, que quiere saber de qué forma ha fomentado Bashar al-Assad el sectarismo en Siria. So we've got Ignacio trying to get connected. We can't hear him yet. We hope we may be able to hear him at least towards the end of the talk. But we have some questions already coming from the audience. This one from Daniel Lopez Roche asks, in which way has Bashar al-Assad increased sectarianism in Syria?
Bashar al-Assad talked about himself being the protector of minorities in Syria. So he said that it's only the regime that can protect the Christians and the Alawi community and other minorities in Syria from the spread of Islamist Sunni jihadism. So that's one way in which he started using sectarian identity to present himself as the only person who can guarantee stability in Syria. So the other thing is there have been several reports of how infiltrators from the regime would go to protests back in 2011 and start using sectarian slogans in these protests as a way to scare these minorities. So the protests slogans that I'm talking about would, for example, threaten people from the Shia community or threaten people from the Christian community and use extremist Sunni kind of language in the slogans in order to present the protests as an extremist led movement rather than a citizen mobilization calling for reform. So the reason why Bashar al-Assad orchestrated that was because he wanted to discredit the protests altogether and say to the world that he is not oppressing an uprising, but he is fighting the spread of extremist terrorism in Syria.
Okay. A ver. Sorry, I thought we were getting some contact with Iñaki. We've got some new questions, fresh new questions, so I'm very happy to receive some of them. This from our friend Ana Planet, who also teaches at the Autonomous University of Madrid. She is concerned about the future of the region regarding the former fighters and militias. She says, especially in economic and social terms, fundamentally in Syria and Iraq. How do you think the role of these former fighters and militias will be, Lina?
It's a very important question. When we say former fighters, there's two categories. One is the domestic former fighters who used to fight with ISIS, for example, a lot of whom are now in prison in Iraq or Syria. The problem there is that there is little transparency in the way these people are being handled. And this is causing the communities that they come from, like their immediate families, to be angry and resentful. And these former fighters themselves are also angry and resentful. And so there is a risk that if they were to be reintegrated into their communities without processes of transitional justice, then this is only going to create a new wave, especially that conditions that led to the rise of ISIS, mainly economic deprivation and political exclusion, are still there, unresolved in these countries. So there is a security risk from the domestic former fighters. But there are also the foreign fighters that are now in prison, mainly in camps, again, in Iraq and Syria. And the problem there is that a lot of European countries, and a lot of these fighters are European, do not want to take them back. And so again, these people are just left in these detention camps almost indefinitely. And this is not going to be a solution to the problem, especially that every now and then we hear reports of people escaping. Not long ago, a few days ago, a Dutch former fighter managed to escape from one of the camps. Of course, locals are escaping as well from the camps. But the problem here is that, again, if you don't put them on trial and deal with them through appropriate legal channels, then you're only postponing the problem. Because again, having them in this situation is not going to rehabilitate them. It's going to keep them angry and extremists. So you really need comprehensive policies in Europe, just like everywhere else where we've seen foreign fighters go to fight in Iraq and Syria, because obviously the foreign fighters are not just from Europe, they come from all kinds of places. So right now, when it comes to dealing with these fighters, unfortunately, a lot of countries don't seem to have viable long-term policies and seem to, in a way, wait for them to perhaps die in these detention camps, hoping that this would solve the problem.
Thank you, Lina. Tenemos muchísimas más preguntas y agradecemos los comentarios y que estéis conectados desde no solo desde Madrid, sino también desde Galicia, desde Venezuela, México y incluso de la Universidad de Lund. Muchos saludos. We have another few questions here, and I was saying that we got so much feedback from not only Madrid, but also other places of Spain, Galicia, and Venezuela, and Mexico. So many comments also on congratulating you for your lecture, Lina. Next question from Maria Roa. She says, Europe's options are somehow limited by the US prioritization of weakening Iran through economic pressure. So what can Spain, or more generally Europe, do in order to alleviate these crises?
Yeah, it's an important dimension. And of course, in my lecture, I focused on the domestic and regional aspect of the conflict, and I didn't talk about the international dimension. But the United States plays a huge role in the three countries, mainly because for the US administration right now, the biggest concern in the Middle East is Iran. And as you heard briefly in my talk, I referenced how Iran supports Hezbollah and supports the popular mobilization units in Iraq, and also supports the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So we have basically the region being seen from the perspective of the US administration of Donald Trump through the prism of Iran. And that means that in a way, solving the Syrian crisis or trying to find a solution for the political stalemate in Lebanon is not really the issue for the US right now. It's all about how to weaken Iran, with these different countries becoming a component of how to weaken Iran. This puts particular strain on Iraq, because Iraq, of course, has a government that is allied with the United States. It has a president and a prime minister who are very friendly with the United States. But at the same time, as I said, it has a parliament in which there are members of parliament who are supported by Iran, and it has political parties supported by Iran and militias supported by Iran, and it's right next to Iran. So Iran is not going to just ignore Iraq. And so the Iraqi government is now in a very difficult situation. On the one hand, it wants to keep good relations with the United States, but on the other hand, it doesn't want to antagonize Iran either. And I don't think they have the answer as to what should be done, because it's a very difficult situation. When it comes to what Europe can do, I mean, we've seen attempts at trying to act as a mediator. I personally think that we need to wait for the outcome of the US election before deciding exactly what to do. Because if the US administration sees Biden taking over as president, then perhaps there could be further collaboration between Europe and the United States on trying to contain Iran through diplomatic means. If President Donald Trump is re-elected, then it's likely that the maximum pressure strategy that the US is pursuing vis-a-vis Iran is going to continue, with increasing pressure on Europe to comply, which leaves Europe with fewer options to kind of try to engage Iran, perhaps through, for example, reactivating the nuclear deal and having the US be part of it again. So I think Europe can play a bit of a mediating role, but again, Europe's own options are limited because of the dominance of the United States on this particular issue.
Mm-hmm. We have a few questions also on other countries that I will pose, especially regarding the Muslim Brotherhood. But I'll bring up on this question from Jose Joaquin Perez. He says, it seems that protests in Lebanon are cross-sectarian. Therefore, could they manage such a transition towards a more peaceful and prosperous system? Or would the conflict be sectarianized? And I will tie it with another question from Carmen Matas, who says that Lina seems to have hope for Lebanon with a society that has not ceased its social mobilization, the protests, despite everything. So does she have the same hope for Syria and Iraq?
I mean, I wish I could say I have the same hope for Syria and Iraq right now. I think Syria will be easier in a way to resolve once there is American political will to do so. Interestingly enough, I don't think that Syria has the same deeply entrenched problems that Iraq and Lebanon have. But right now, I don't have much hope because I don't see much American will to try to steer this conflict towards a resolution. And I firmly believe that it's only the United States that can do that through engaging Russia and trying to find a diplomatic way out. If this were to happen, Syria has cultivated in the last decade lots of civil society groups, lots of intellectuals, activists, people who have learned politics kind of in a very much organic way, but who can play a very important role in steering the country to a better future. And they're just waiting for the opportunity to do so. And unfortunately, as I said, it's not in their hands to kind of change the direction of the conflict, but they are there. But right now, I don't see that. In Lebanon, I am hopeful in the future, not right now, again. And this ties into the question on sectarianism. What gives me hope is that the people mobilizing are from different sectarian backgrounds, different social backgrounds, different geographical backgrounds. This is unprecedented in Lebanon, to have people be together on the street from all social classes and sects and basically say, we want a secular state that represents the national interest. For these people to be in power, we need to wait a very long time, unfortunately, because as we can see, the system is hard to crack. And unlike Syria, where I firmly believe there's no domestic agency in this conflict, really, it's really about the external powers. It's about Russia and the US. I think Lebanon has more domestic agency. And as we can see, the political parties in the country are able to, in a way, ruin things by being very stubborn. But in the long run, I still have faith in the new generation. When it comes to Iraq, perhaps this is also one of the more difficult ones. The younger generation is showing a lot of courage. I mean, despite all the coercion, despite the hundreds of people who have been killed and the thousands who have been injured, people still take to the streets and protest. But because of the presence of Iran next door, and because Iran is the key factor behind keeping this kind of system in Iraq in place, and I'm not here talking about the mechanics of the political system, I'm talking about this system that is very much serving Iranian interests indirectly through the presence of the militias, etc., it's going to be very difficult to roll back these militias. And if the Hezbollah example is taken into consideration, I worry that some of these groups, perhaps in the future, might evolve to become, a dominant political force in a similar way, which means that it's going to be very even more difficult for these young people in Iraq who are protesting to kind of try to change the system. But the thing about Iraq is it's not absolute. There is always a negotiation going on. And right now, the state is resorting to coercion because it has failed to quell the protests in any other way. It tried patronage, it didn't work. It tried sectarianism and ideology, it didn't work. So now it's trying coercion, but even that is not quite working when it comes to people protesting, because they're still protesting. So I think eventually there might be some sort of negotiation that would, in a way, take into consideration some of the demands of these protesters. But to change the system, it's very complicated, especially that, again, in a way, a bit like Syria, you also have external actors being the most dominant forces dictating the scene inside Iraq. So mixed levels of hope for the three countries.
Thank you, Lina. That also replies to another question from Ared Garcia, who wanted to know what is the role of civil society in Syria and Iraq. So I think you've answered that. We're going to move to, and I'm not going through the questions for those of you who think I'm forgetting your questions. They're not going through immediately in the chronological order, but I tried to gather some of them in terms of subjects. So this question from Melania Brito, she says that she's found that the Egyptian regime benefits from counter-terrorist intervention through the implementation of new law reforms in order to legitimize the restriction of civil rights. Do you think, she says, that legislative device also applies to the Lebanese security apparatus and the government to get away with the repression of civil rights, protests included? And if I may, I will bring in another question, since we're going through the also the Egyptian case. Daniel Martin wants to know if there's any way of parallelism between the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Hezbollah in Lebanon in terms of being an institution integrated in the social fabric. And if that's the case, could we face a similar situation in Lebanon after the protest of 2019, as is nowadays the case in Egypt? I don't know if that sort of like makes sense, how I've gathered those two questions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna start with the Muslim Brotherhood issue. Interesting comparison. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hezbollah learned from one another in terms of tactics. But there's a huge difference between the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Hezbollah, in that in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood enjoys a lot of popular support but the regime in charge is completely against the Muslim Brotherhood and has basically declared it a terrorist organization. In Lebanon, Hezbollah enjoys wide support amongst a third of the population, so not as much support as the Muslim Brotherhood has in Egypt, but Hezbollah dominates the political system. And so it's very difficult to kind of then make a comparison based on these very divergent dynamics in both places. The key thing is the Muslim Brotherhood splintered as a result of coercion from the state when President Sisi came to power. And this has caused some of its elements to turn to violence. With Hezbollah, let's imagine a scenario in which there's a new system in place and a new regime that is against Hezbollah and that cracks down on Hezbollah. Of course, we're going to see a similar scenario because this is not the best way to deal with any ideological movement. Basically, I'm against coercion, even against, militias. I don't think this is the way to deal with them. So if anything, I would regard the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a cautionary tale. It's a case of how not to deal politically with entities like that. Now, when it comes to the use of oppression in Egypt, I think this is a very crucial tool, unfortunately, that is used everywhere in the region. To crack down on civil liberties and prevent people from protesting and mobilizing. So in Lebanon, for example, although the country is in relative terms more open than others when it comes to freedom of association and expression, more in kind of recent months, we've seen people being arrested for criticizing the president on Facebook, for example. People being arrested and accused of collaborating with Israel because they're just activists, but these are the accusations that get hurled at them, which basically makes their arrest an issue of national security. We see the same thing in Syria, people accused of terrorism and arrested, and also in Iraq. We see the security forces cracking down on the basis that protesters are threatening national security. So unfortunately, yes, this tactic is used by regimes in the region across the board.
Mm-hmm. We got a question. We're going to go slightly to the many of these questions raise the influence of other actors, and we know that all these three countries have a very deep penetration of foreign interests, proxy wars that are being fought on their grounds. So we have two different questions. One is on the role of Russia. Russia, says Marcos Garcia Rey, has got access to warm waters through military seaports in Syria. Meanwhile, the US has abandoned its influence in Syria. How do you assess the political influence of Russia on Damascus? So that's number one. Then we're going back to the question on sectarianism. And Daniel Lopez raises the possibility that sectarianism is mainly promoted by state elites, you say, but do you think that also other countries and actors could have an important influence? So you have a question more on the role of Russia on Syria, and the other one on foreign powers fanning sectarianism.
Yeah, when it comes to Russia, it's now the power broker in Syria. It's not able to tell the regime to do what it wants all the time, but I will say most of the time. Without Russia, I think the regime of Bashar al-Assad would have fallen a long time ago. it needed Russia for survival, and in return, it turned itself into a client of Russia's. So now, no resolution to the conflict in Syria can happen without Russian engagement and without Russian blessing, unfortunately. And Russia saw in Syria a very easy platform to assert itself vis-a-vis the West, mainly vis-a-vis the United States. And it's not going to give up this position unless it has to. And right now, as I said, without American political will to engage Russia, Russia is just going to continue to have this influence in Syria because it doesn't have anyone really contesting it. The second question is on foreign powers stoking sectarianism. Well, I spoke about Iran and how influential it is in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon. Iran is also stoking sectarianism in all these countries. So, for example, in Syria, there have been attempts, although on a limited scale, to try to spread Shiism in the country. Now, Syria only has 1 to 2% of its population being Shia, unlike Lebanon and Iraq, where you have a lot more than that. And so there is no natural grassroots constituency for Iran in these countries. So it's trying to cultivate them. And at the same time, it has moved some militias to settle in Syria with their families. These are Shia militias that come from Afghanistan or Pakistan or elsewhere, and they are staying in Syria as a way for Iran to cultivate grassroots support so that it would have long-term influence in the country, even if politically it kind of doesn't go very far. So this means it has to rally them around a particular identity, and it uses Shia identity to kind of do that. When it comes to Lebanon, if anyone's looking at recent reports in Lebanon, they will see that a lot of the Hezbollah supporters that are showing up in the media or on the streets are starting to shout Shia, Shia, Shia. And that's because they're trying to present the protests in Lebanon as being against the Shia community, which is ironic because the protests have people from the Shia community also protesting. So here we have a spin, basically, very much blessed by Iran in stoking this kind of sectarianism. But then you have other countries that have done similar things when it comes to the Sunni communities in the region. And here, namely, we're talking about Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who, especially in the context of Syria, chose to support armed groups of an Islamist nature. And these armed groups very much started championing Sunni sectarian rhetoric in the context of the conflict, which of course made the conflict even worse. So unfortunately, we have domestic drivers behind sectarianism, but also you have these regional countries meddling, whether Sunni or Shia meddling, it's still meddling, and it's stoking sectarian tension.
Mm-hmm. There is a question that has been asked twice, both by Nuria Pedrosa and by Mike, and both of them, or same person, who want to know what interest does Syria have on the resolution of repatriation of foreign fighters to their countries of origin? Quite a specific question.
Okay. I mean, when it comes to foreign fighters, if we're talking about the Syrian regime, I will say that it is in the interest of the Syrian regime for the foreign fighters not to be in Syria because they are a source of instability. But at the same time, the regime has often instrumentalized situations like that to put pressure on the West. So we have a bit of a delicate situation here, in which on the one hand, they may be a source of instability for the regime, but at the same time, they could be a tool for the regime to say, if the world does not normalize relations with the regime once more, then there is a risk of these foreign fighters going back to their places of origin and engaging in terrorist activities there. So it's a double-edged sword, this one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're coming towards the end of our talk, and I really want to thank Lina for all the great insights and also her delivery, which is, I think, very clear for our audiences, and of course thank everyone that has taken part and asked questions. We have a question that is, I think, one of inevitable in these types of talks, where there's so much information about the let's say weaknesses of the state institutions, the corruption. It's all pervasive. Everything seems to be crumbling. So someone called the foundation Fundación Horacio Ducharne says it is a very difficult situation. It seems that a new social, political, and economic order is required. What chance to call for a new constitution for the region? I think George W. Bush tried that already before, but let us hear what Lina has to say on it.
I think this is the grand question on which to end on a grand note. Well, what is needed is a new social contract. If we don't want to talk about the word order, which may sound a bit imperialist and scary, let's look at it from the bottom up. What's needed is a new social contract. Interestingly enough, Lebanon, after the civil war, had a new constitution brokered through the Ta'if Agreement, which is the peace accord that ended the war. But that constitution was never implemented. That constitution said that Lebanon would work towards getting rid of its sectarian political system, and that instead it would have a system based on merit. That was never implemented. So in a lot of cases, the constitution is not the problem. In Syria as well, although now there's a constitutional committee that's part of the Geneva peace talks, if you look at the Syrian constitution itself, it may not be amazing, but it's not that bad. The issue is not the constitution. The issue is the way these constitutions are implemented. So what is really needed is a new social contract between the leaders and the people that respects the right of the individual as a political entity and as a human being, and respects human rights and all the things that we in the West really take for granted. And for that to happen, you both need grassroots mobilization, but you also need the West to help and the international community to help. And if I may end on a critical note on that level, unfortunately, very often international powers have ended up keeping these corrupt elites in place in the region because either they see them as the only choice, when the reality is, as I said, there are lots of talented people out there. We're not limited to these awful people. Or they think of them as guaranteeing stability in their countries. But as you can see, eventually we're seeing instability because you can't oppress people indefinitely. Eventually the people will rise up. Or they see them as their kind of loyalists. So they want to keep them in place so that they have channels of communication with the countries. And this means sometimes the international actors turn a blind eye to the transgressions of these individuals, such as corruption, because they think, no, we need to keep them in power because this way we can have influence. So I will say that the situation in the region is a shared responsibility between the domestic actors as well as the international actors.
Thank you very much, Lina Khatib, for really answering most of the questions that have been asked today. It was, I think, an excellent turnout in terms of participation. It is also our first bilingual with no subtitling or translation live conference. So again, thank you very much for the joining the experiment. I think it's been quite successful. I'll just do a quick announcement also in Spanish. Pues simplemente agradecer a todos los que se han conectado. Hemos tenido, como habéis visto, estudiantes de la Autónoma, de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, de la Complutense, de la Universidad Rey Juan Carlos también, de la Escuela Diplomática, la Universidad de Granada, de La Coruña, en Santiago de Compostela también, y como decía, desde Venezuela, México, Palestina, Suecia, Escocia. Bueno, realmente creo que la charla de Lina ha sido muy estimulante, y el poder intentar en este tiempo que sabemos que es difícil tratar de resolver estas cuestiones en una hora, pero yo creo que realmente es por lo menos un esfuerzo para entender mejor o utilizar la experiencia, el análisis, la lupa de Lina Khatib para poder entender mucho mejor la actualidad de estos tres países, y sin duda de también el entorno, ¿no? De lo que hablábamos de otros actores. Lamentamos mucho no haber podido hacer la conexión con Ignacio Gutiérrez de Terán. A veces pues nos traiciona un poco la tecnología. Sin embargo, pues el objetivo de tener a Lina en vivo y en directo desde Italia, pues lo hemos conseguido. Recordar que esta conferencia además va a estar disponible en nuestro canal YouTube para que puedan verla cuantas veces quieran. Y bueno, sin más, vamos a despedirnos de Lina. Lina, once again, thank you very much. Shukran jazilan. We hope to see you in Madrid or Córdoba when this is over.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise. And thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everyone for the really fantastic questions. I wish we were there in person. But then again, perhaps we would not have had Venezuela and Mexico and other places on the line otherwise. So there's a bit of an advantage to this new world we're in. But definitely hope to see you.
Thank you very much. And congratulations from our audience who are sending also their greetings and best regards.